Coming from Africa, actually we can relate, and I have been amazed on how a lot of the experiences are very similar, even if the legislation is slightly different. And for example, there is no recognition of a third gender in Mozambique, so it's very much binary. But the discussions and some of the issues that are coming up, I can definitely relate to them. And I will sort of try to talk about what we have been doing and the reason why I'm here and part of this panel. I'm part of a larger study based in Norway, as you said, that is trying to look at political determinants of sexual and reproductive rights. It includes issues of abortion, but also LGBT rights. And the overall picture in Africa is that a lot of the African countries have been becoming more and more conservative with extremely dangerous laws for LGBT people. And Siri, who is leading this group, thought that the examples of South Africa and Mozambique would be interesting because legislation in South Africa was already more liberal. In Mozambique, from 2015, we have taken out the 2 articles that criminalized LGBT relations. So it is not criminalized. There are some issues as are only and not registered LGBT association has been saying. There are not enough non-discriminatory legislation. The only thing is just it's not criminalized, but there are no protections in place except in the labor law that someone is trying to change. That was the only law that had non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, I think you can go to the 3rd slide. Just to, no, before, yeah. We are conducting a survey of 90 LGBT persons, of whom 15 are trans women and 15 are trans men. The remaining are men and women. So in the men, it can either be gay or bisexual men, or in the women, lesbians or bisexual women. We are focusing on health, and we intended to compare with Sudan. Now it's a bit difficult to do the Sudan because of the whole situation, because Sudan is one of the countries that is highly criminalized. Homosexuality is highly criminalized with the potential of death. And so we wanted to see whether the experiences of a country with a criminalization of homosexuality and a country with non-criminalization, whether the experiences would be similar, just to sort of try to talk about how legislation is not always necessarily enough, just to take away some of the stigma and discrimination. We conducted interviews. LGBT activists were the ones conducting the interviews. There's a lot of issue with protection of the subjects that are being interviewed. We have also collected some life histories with photo voices, which I will share too. And we are trying to focus, based on the whole experience of training the activists to conduct the interviews, focusing a lot more on gender and identity rather on sexual orientation. And we're trying to get away also from this issue of HIV/AIDS, trying to see the person, who is the person and the personal experiences. Next slide, please. So I would like to introduce the team. So these are the different people between us researchers and the activists. So it's me. Knife is one of the persons I will share the photo voice with. Elias is the data manager. Katia is another person I will share the photo voice. Then there is Susanna, who is assistant researcher. There is Paulette. There is Chuchu. So Paulette is the lesbian activist, Chuchu is the gay activist, there is Katarina, who is also a research assistant. She's doing the live histories. She's an anthropologist like me. Then there is Becky. She's also a lesbian activist. And there is Eldon, who's a gay activist as well. And we have 2 lesbians and 2 gay activists because they have a larger number, 30 people that were going to be interviewed. After a week, this is the last day. So when we started, and this is important to say, when we started there wasn't enough trust. Naif, for example, introduced himself with the name attributed at birth. And I was a bit confused because I wasn't sure who was going to be the trans man activist. And because he introduced himself with a female name, I was confused. And this was because trust had not been established. Chuchu introduced himself as a journalist. And only on the second day he said he was gay. So at the end of the training, trust had been established, and then people were free to. And I think it comes with what you have been saying. It's strategic and performative who we are when we present ourselves, because there needs to be protection, even if it's not a crime. Next slide, please. Now, there are a few things being done in Mozambique in terms of works on LGBT people and discussions. There are newspaper articles. A lot of them have been sort of in favor of LGBT rights. Lambda is our association that, as I said, despite it not being a crime, they haven't been able to register themselves. They are working under the umbrella of a feminist umbrella group, which everyone always becomes surprised, because since the LGBT group also includes transgender people, and usually feminists and transgender are at odds with each other in the world. People are usually surprised, but they have been able to work under this umbrella. There are some monographs being published from the psychology and anthropology departments. So some people are working on homosexuality, but these are unpublished, and there is no follow-through. And there is a book from 2 of these monographs that has been published under the umbrella of this LGBT association. But that generally there is very little being done. How it started, it was more related to public health and HIV/AIDS. And I think this is the common history. And it was about men who have sex with men. So it was about HIV/AIDS prevention. And then it slowly became about rights and the discussion of rights, and there started to have some backlash. There is some discussion on discrimination, about tolerance. For example, the Afrobarometers establishes Mozambique as one of the most tolerant African countries in relation to LGBT people. There's the urban and rural divide, and usually it's saying the more educated, the younger, and the urban population is more tolerant. I will talk about how it is actually with trans people, which is not exactly the same thing. Sexuality and sexual orientation, sexual and reproductive rights is also very strong, which makes LGBT people the focus on sexuality and not on being people beyond their sexuality. There's a lot about identity as well, and in this comes the issue of gender. And for trans people, gender is actually something much stronger than for lesbian and gays to whom it's the sexual orientation and the right to have the sexual orientation. So issues of gender, and for me, who've been working on women's issues and gender, working with trans issues actually makes a lot of sense with all the gender issues that I've been working on, and really reinforces everything that the feminists have been trying to say, that gender is a social construct and it should be looked at as that. There are some studies on diversity, and there is now one study coming out on humor as resistance, especially on from trans women, how they use humor as a form of resistance, how all the insults that they get, they sort of transform this into a resistance humor and reuse the insults because it's very strong. I will talk about this a little bit later. Next slide, please. These are some references. I think we can go to the next slide. Now, the gaps that we have identified based on what exists in terms of literature is there is not enough discussion on gender as opposed to sexual orientation and identity. There needs to be more discussion on gender. But also these categories that are extremely fixed. Also in our discussions when we were doing the training, we have realized that the categories are not fixed, and it's not about people being in process, not knowing who they are, but the everyday life and experience that people have that sort of doesn't conform, not just in terms of how they identify as just one name, cannot define them. And one person's experience is different from the other, which makes that how then they perform or exist is different. So here we would have the identity fluidity, we would have the gender fluidity that has nothing to do with not knowing who the person is. Of course, being in different moments in time also may change, and being with different people also may change how we perform. Okay, so there's a lot of intersectionality that is not discussed, historical practices, as you said, that have been forgotten. Also in Africa, a lot of people say, no, this is not African. It's something new, it has come from the West. It's, there is not enough written about how practices have, which practices have existed and which have not, which are new, and learning to accept this. Religion and spirituality is also something that hasn't been explored. There are trans people who are, for example, traditional healers, which gives them certain prestige. And trans women in rural areas who have been integrated as having inherited, for example, a deceased grandmother or aunt spirit. There is also not enough trying to establish a difference between the experiences of the different LGBT people. When it lumps together the discrimination experiences, then it tends to maybe focus on certain experiences and in detriment to others. Despite the fact that our association being under this feminist umbrella group, trans women have said that the feminist movement does not consider them as women, and they feel discriminated because of this. So this is also a gap in research that we have learned. And there are numerous health effects to trans people that go beyond to men who have sex with men that haven't been addressed, both for trans women and trans men. Next, please. So I would like to just share the two photo voices. Next one, this is Katia. And so I will read her voice. We won't play the video because it's in Portuguese, so I'll read the English translation. Hello, good afternoon. I am Katia. I am recording this video now. This video is especially to give strength to the manas. Manas means sisters. To the bonecas, this means dolls. Here in Mozambique, we call bonecas the trans women. I am trans. I would like to give you strength to be strong. Don't be intimidated by anyone or anything. Life is one. Life is unique. Be happy as you are. Release this human spirit we have inside. Nothing can keep you from being happy. Be happy. Clothe yourself as you wish. I give you strength to all, and be happy. And then this is what she does. This is Katya's voice. I would like to go to Knife's voice. So this is Knife. He sent 2 pictures, which he says he identifies with both. The important aspect here, because I ask, can we go back? The important aspect in both pictures, because I ask, is there a difference between any of them? I sense some fluidity here. And what he said was that the important thing was about the LGBT rainbow. And so his voice, next slide. His voice is to be LGBT. So he sent this text, which I translated. To be LGBT is super hard. We face all kind of things that bother us, from the little jokes that I am used to hear, like, she looks just like a real man. She has become a man. You don't even look trans. But if I get with him, will I be a lesbian? It's just a phase. These and several other things, a transsexual is not grounds for curiosity. To be a trans man is not something different. It is special. We are people who need a place in society. To be LGBT is to be different but the same. This is Knife's voice. I would like now to, just 2 slides more, which is just to close. Next. To talk about fluidity. So the issues that have come up on fluidity, or talking about not just LGBT in general, but trans in particular, that we had to change our survey because we had the categories, and our activists said it will be difficult when we talk to people because people not always identify with these categories. So some people might prefer to be called he and still identified as a lesbian. Some people might be preferred to be called a she and still identify as gay. Not because that they are not aware, even though in terms of the association, they would say, oh, they are not educated yet. And this, I would say, it's sort of trying to normatize and putting people into boxes when people actually just look at themselves in multiple ways. So not always lack of information. Some women, and this was in trying to recruit lesbian women to be interviewed, they didn't identify either way. They claimed that they would be active if they had a lesbian sexual partner, but they would be passive if they had a trans man as a sexual partner. So they don't want to have an identity. And this also is something that we need to accept as a possibility. And one academician I talked to, he said, well, it's just being queer. It doesn't need to have a name. There is an issue that is very important for both trans men and trans women, which is the performance of the gender. And one of the major aggressions that can happen is to try and take away, for example, to cut the hair of a trans woman, to take away the nails, to force her to wear men's clothes, and vice versa, to force a man to wear women's clothes, to force them to marry, the corrective rapes. These are some of the aggressions, forcing them to have children. These are some of the things that the trans people have been going through. Which then makes it that there is a lot of strategic transitional survival performance, which makes it difficult sometimes for people to know whether it's because they feel differently or it's because they need in order to survive. And the last slide I would like is some of the issues that we've been thinking that we might need to go into in our study. Whether biology affects discrimination of autonomy, and this specifically because of expectations of masculinity and femininity. how trans women have a specific and very aggressive form of discrimination because of expectations of masculinity. And there was a difference in our results in terms of how families abandoned more trans women than they did trans men, even though trans men had more difficulty in expressing and performing their masculinity, and were more, publicly, they were more likely to actually undermine their male performance. Now, how does perception of consequence affect the strategies of performance? Not always the lived experiences equaled the actual perception of how severe it can be. So it can be based also on a collective trauma. So looking at this collective trauma would also for us be very interesting. And finally, in which ways does gender identity compromise health, and whether fluidity could actually counter the negative health effects of being a trans person? Thank you.
Thank you very much.